material that you received, but just in case, I want you to know that BLEWS, the Black-Jewish Forum of Baltimore, was established in 1978 by leaders in both communities dedicated to continuing and perpetuating the Black-Jewish partnership that flourished during the Civil Rights movement, the Civil Rights struggle. Time, discord, and even turbulence have taken their toll on Black-Jewish relations, but the will and rationale to continue working together toward an America of greater equality, opportunity, tolerance, and justice have not diminished. We have, and at some point I'm sure as we meet through these 6 months, you will hear a very strong youth program, but we also now, through some generous donations, which others will talk about, are able to have a leadership program to bring leaders in the Black and Jewish community together to learn about each other, to learn about issues. And I am going to turn the program over now to Matthew Weinstein, who has chaired and been a slave driver with us for the Leadership Development Program, Dialogue, Diversity, and Direction, and to Alvin Gillard, who is one of our committee members and a board member of BLEWS.
Thank you, Marlon, and good evening and welcome to Dialogue, Diversity, and Direction, our BLEWS Black Jewish Leadership Initiative. This day has been a little over 2 years in the making, and we're very excited that you're all here tonight, that you've signed up for the program and made the commitment for the next 6 months, for the dozen or so meetings that make up the schedule, that we think will be very interesting and educational and exciting, and will open windows and our eyes about many things, and in a way that will enrich, of course, our own lives and perspectives, but also enable us to better enrich the life of our community in the years to come. I want to acknowledge the other committee members who are here this evening. Bernie Berkowitz, who's also the executive director of BLEWS, is here. Penny McCrimmon is a BLEWS board member and member of the committee. And George Faber is here as well, is a BLEWS board member. And are there any other board members that I didn't mention that are here, committee members? Okay, good. And we also want to thank Coppin and Dennis Roberts for being here videotaping the proceedings this evening. This class of the Leadership Initiative is actually not the first. This program was conducted twice in the course of BLEWS' 28 or so year history. And that happened because of the vision and the energy of one person, Ruth Wolf Rehfeld. We lost Ruth in 2003, and her husband, Rex, thought that it would be a fitting tribute to her legacy to help endow this program and make it possible. And so I want to ask Rex to come up to the podium and say a few words.
There'll be a very few words. Thanks, Matthew, for the introduction. Thank you, BLEWS, for this program. This was certainly something that was very high on Ruth's goals in life. It's a privilege to be included and to have helped. Ruth was a very elegant and spirited lady. She was a lady with high intelligence. She was a lady with a great deal of love for those close to her. Perhaps above all, she was a lady with strong opinions. And those of you that have worked with her know that. And among those opinions, with agreement with the words of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal. Though she, of course, would have modified that to read that all persons, as a matter of fact, from Ruth's perspective, that all women and men are created equal. And to her, that meant exactly what it says, with no reservations for creed, color, race, religion, sexual orientation, political party, or whatever. Well, with a certain exception, she did have a little bit of discrimination or so. She never voted for a Republican except for Mac Mathias and Theodore McKellar. I once got her to give some money where a friend of mine who's a Republican who ran, I won't mention who it was or anything, and she got very upset. But I made her write the check because at that time my firm was going through some changes and I didn't know what the rules were. She said, "Why am I giving to a Republican?" No, we got that. She held a number of positions through her lifetime, some more involved with the issue of Black-Jewish relations than others, but she always brought the subject into her workplace whenever she could. And for more information about her background, her life, and all that sort of thing, her obituary is in your section 4 of your workbook. But from her perspective, the crowning achievement of her life was to have asked to help establish the BLEWS and its program. She was its first executive director. She never thought she was unique. Only one among many in this community who believed as she did and worked to achieve the same goals. Thank you.
Thank you, Rex. And I also can convey greetings from Theo Rogers from the Adams Foundation, who was very sorry that he was out of town and not able to be here to greet everyone this evening. Hopefully he'll be able to make it to one of the future programs. Okay. I now want to turn the podium over to Alvin Gillard, who is the Executive Director of the Baltimore City Human Relations Commission and a board member of BLEWS. And one of our committee members for this program. And he will be leading the round of introductions so that we can all begin to meet each other.
Great. Good evening, everyone. Thanks, Matthew. We're going to make this as painless as possible. Man, Schmoke, how you doing? You snuck in on me. Good to see you. About a week or two ago, Bernie Berkowitz sent to me the stack of accepted applications from all of you guys applying to be participants in this leadership training. And I had an opportunity to thumb through the stack of applications, and I was amazed at the diversity within that stack of applications when you gave consideration to the fact that this is a program that's primarily aimed at blacks and Jews. So within the context of blacks and Jews, you would think that the spectrum would not be that great, but the experiences that you all bring to this training is remarkable. So what we'd like to do for the next few moments or so is to give you an opportunity to talk a little bit about yourself, the things that you're presently engaged in, but perhaps more importantly, what about this leadership training was attractive to you? What you either heard or knew about the training that said to you, maybe this is something that I want to take part in. And we also sent you probably a week or two ago some reading material, and hopefully you've had an opportunity to actually read the reading material. So you may have some thoughts on the material that you did have an opportunity to read. So we're going to ask for a volunteer to just take a moment, tell us who you are, a little bit about yourself, and why you wanted to participate in this program. And I'm so glad that my good friend Monica Wilson has volunteered. She knew I was going to do it. I could tell that she knew. Monica, why don't you tell us who you are, a little bit about yourself, and what attracted you?
What attracted me? Why don't we start there? Alvin Gillard has been my boss for the last 9 years. I'm an investigator for the Community Relations Commission. I've been investigating employment discrimination for 9 years. I think as an African-American female, born and raised in Baltimore City, but I went to Friends School for 15 years, so I think I had a very diverse upbringing. I've been to bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and I have plenty of Jewish friends, black friends, you name it. And it just seemed like it would be a worthwhile experience to do some networking and kind of figure out, why God had me grow up to be this diverse individual and what He intends for me to do with the different experiences that I've had. And it's an excellent networking opportunity.
Great. Do you have anyone else? Keith, I saw your hand.
Keith doesn't work for me. Close. My name is Keith Murphy, and I work for the Maryland Commission on Human Relations, where I'm a human relations specialist. My supervisor, our executive director, had said to me and brought it to my attention, and we had a discussion, and I'll share the discussion, is that he came in and said to me, well, you're not black nor Jewish. But, and I said, well, my heritage is Jewish. My father's family were Jews. But converted when they came to the United States 200 years ago. I don't know why. It's either they ended up where all the Baptists were, and they decided we're not going to struggle against them. But I've worked in the area of diversity training, cultural competence for about 5 or 6 years, and even in my earlier training, I worked from Planned Parenthood through lots of different agencies, and I've just seen the impact that disparities found between religion and race and lots of different things, and how it impacts different groups of people. And a part of what I want to grow as a person is to learn a lot more about what's going on and how historically that's happened and what's going on now and how our histories impact that.
Great. Great. Wendell?
I kind of thought that was good. Hi, my name is Wendell Phillips. I'm now working with the Department of Juvenile Services, stationed basically at Gay Street, the new huge building that takes up all of Gay Street. As kind of doing community outreach and also standing in as a public information officer for the entire department when the public information officer is out, which seems to be quite often. I was a former legislator, for some crazy reason, wished to be again. And just part of what the district that I represented had changed so much with the redistricting, and it actually picked up a larger Jewish segment where it was almost totally African American beforehand. And in the campaign that I was running, and there was so much othering going on that I was rather uncomfortable with. It just wasn't what I came from, wasn't how I grew up, and it was hard to really press that when you're thinking of trying to bring folks together. How are you going to just play the numbers and just operate? Well, it's a 70% African American district, 30% white and or other. Let's just deal with the 70% that's going to get us elected. Okay, but on the outside chance that you win, how do you then coalesce with these people who you pretty much pushed to the side and acted that you didn't need it? So it wasn't really something that I was feeling. And I don't think it's any accident that it just kind of happened. Here we are in election year again. And here I'll be running in the same district again, where this opportunity comes up to deal and talk with folk and see you on a different level other than knocking your door, can I have your vote or something like that, but just to really get an understanding. And so I can be understood as well. Not solely for that purpose, but just that's always what I've done. Also something else that we're doing for the year 2006, a guest editor for Baltimore Magazine in their series on diversity. We approached them about, you all rarely do anything about people of color or anything else in your magazine. How about you do a 13th issue on race and ethnicity in Baltimore? And they, to their credit, bit at it and wanted to do it. However, it morphed. We approached them in 2003. It's now come out in 2006. So what they'll do is put a little bit into the fabric of what is Baltimore Magazine for the entire year. So you'll be seeing stories dealing with race and ethnicity and kind of what we call the changing face of Baltimore. That's it.
Great. Right answer.
41st.
Okay, my name is Steve Forspencer, and I heard about this because I saw an announcement. I'm a relatively mature, I won't say old. I won't say mature either because I didn't grow up. But I wanted this opportunity to get back involved in the movement. I graduated college in 1957, and I was in a fight with the school because we had no black students. I grew up in a household of socially aware people. My mother organized the Municipal Employees Union in New York. My father ran guns to Spain. I got active in the civil rights movement in the early 60s. Then moved to Baltimore, which was a culture shock because I came from New York. I tried to be involved in blues initially when I came here, which is 23 years ago. And that was more culture shock as far as some of the dialogue that was going on, which I had thought we had passed 20 years ago, at least in a couple of places I've been, in New York and even in some involvement in the Midwest. But I stayed interested. Rabbi Herman put together a group with Brown's Memorial Church, and I was a participant in that. And I began to feel that we were getting to a dialogue that I understood. And I've been here. I think I'm as much a both a Moorian as people will accept, since I wasn't born here. But I want to get back. And that's why
Great. Thanks, Steve. Who wants to go next? Go right ahead.
My name is Bill Heyman. I don't work for the government. I'm sorry. I'm an attorney at a law firm downtown. I have 2 children. I'm interested in the program because I went to meet new people, different people, really, where I live. It's pretty much in Pikesville, and my particular neighborhood is like a lot of Baltimore. I mean, it's pretty segregated, I guess you would say. And in fact, there's one house in the neighborhood that has Christmas tree lights. And you know, I think Baltimore is great, and it's a great town that it's so diverse, and we don't have opportunities to mix as much. I mean, socially, I'm involved in boards for the Associated Jewish Charities, so I see people there. I go to my synagogue. I see there's a few, actually, black people who come. But maybe you go to church, and people who go to church have the same experience, right? I didn't think Jewish people are there, obviously. So this is a great opportunity to meet other people, network, and help Baltimore. I think Baltimore's, you know, I've been to the Midwest, I've been to many places, and we're very lucky. I think that we have such a diverse community. It's a real asset. So that's what I'm here.
Thanks, Bill. Who's next?
I'll volunteer.
Go right ahead.
Hi, everybody. My name is Serena Spencer Burnett, and I'm a product of Baltimore. I grew up in the Ashburn community, and many of you know Wendell, but I know Wendell was a fool. Oh my gosh. So I grew up in the Ashburn community of Baltimore. I found out about blues through Penny McCrimmon and Jeanette Whitmire, who are 2 board members. And it was exactly 10 days I'll finish my master's in organizational management. And Penny said, Rita, you have to join blues. You know, I want you to look at, read and do all your research about blues, and you know, the networking is there and the opportunities are there. And when I did my homework, it's an organization that I'm really, really interested in. So this is why I'm here.
Wonderful. Great. Who's next? Yes, ma'am.
Good evening. I am Ruth Elmore. I've been in the Baltimore area for about 12 years. I am originally from Olean, New York, which is a small town outside of Buffalo, with an African-American population of 1%. So moving here was a little bit of a culture shock. So I am a leadership and organizational development consultant with MedStar Health System, and with that I build relationships. A lot of times the managers will come to me saying that they have team building problems, and do some little research and find out it's really them that are the problem, not the team. Usually. I do some one-on-one coaching. In addition, my passion is coaching and diversity training. I'm a certified diversity trainer, but I felt that my circle wasn't very diverse, so I needed to do something about that. If I'm going to be involved in diversity training, I needed to do something about building relationships outside of it. So that's one reason I wanted to come to the program, in addition just to learn and absorb all I can learn.
Great. And I think Steve is familiar with your town. I saw him nodding. Great. Okay. Who's next? Yes,
I
ma'am.
would like people to complain about this much stuff.
My name is Carrie Ingerman, and I moved to this city 40 years ago about, from Chicago, Illinois, where I lived through the civil rights movement and the marching in the streets. And back then, Chicago, too, was a pretty segregated city. And until I went to college, which I did in downtown Chicago, I really didn't mix with African Americans. And I see how my whole circle has changed, and now I proudly say I have a nephew who's African American. But I had taught in Baltimore City up until this past June, or 15 years prior. I saw problems both ways. I'm now teaching at Utica Academy, which has got other problems both ways. And I just want to see what I can continue to do to keep things moving in the right direction.
Who's next?
My name is Mark Newstead. I'm also not from Baltimore. And actually I'm a marketing consultant, and I'm trying to figure out if this group is more people from Baltimore or which would be interesting. It would be interesting to me if it were more than 50% transplants. I'm originally from the DC area. I've been here since 1981. My work, I do marketing consulting mostly with colleges and universities, some cultural institutions, but mostly colleges and universities. And so diversity is an issue that I deal with a lot. I work with a lot of small selected institutions for whom diversity is a huge priority. So I'm immersed in it. I do a lot of research. I conduct focus groups on diverse audiences. I also see a lot of the hypocrisy around the theme of diversity. I see the limitations of it. So it's something that interests me. But I was going to say, I think probably my real motivation for being here is the experience of my daughter. We live in Charles Village, and she graduated from a Jewish day school in 8th grade, and now goes to Baltimore City College, which I think is which is predominantly African American. And she is having just such a wonderful experience, such a rich experience, really immersing herself in a majority black culture. And it's such a phenomenal learning experience for her, such a rare experience. I think it's an experience that so few people get, that I thought I'd try to keep up with my 16-year. I know that's impossible to do. I thought I'd do my bit to kind of keep the family kind of building our understanding.
Great. Hello. I'm Nate Braverman, and I grew up in Northwest Baltimore, the corridor where we proudly then said we're a little Africa Metro Israel. Really, when I grew up, there were two types of people in the world as far as when they were Jews, because we lived in a segregated area, and there were African Americans, because they lived sort of just behind us, following that Northwest migration. I remember, matters of race have always been a front burner. I can remember vividly learning about segregation when Oak Citizens occurred. Those of you who are locals and are of that age, I remember sitting in class at Cross Country Elementary School when we got our first bus students, and some of those experiences. To progress to go to Pimlico Junior High School, where all of a sudden then I was a minority. And Northwestern High School remained a minority. Now I work in the district court in Baltimore City, where white faces, certainly in the front looking out, are a distinct minority. So matters of race just have always been there. There were many times when thought things were getting better, and thought things were pretty good between whites and blacks in Baltimore City in general, between Jews and blacks in particular. There are times when I think they're getting worse. So it's a subject that's always intrigued me. It's always been real to me, still is real to me on a day-to-day basis. And when I saw this opportunity through Beth Am Synagogue, they sent something around to our social action committee. And those who know that Beth Am, it's in Reservoir Hill. It's in another interesting part of town. I thought it was something, a dialogue that I'd like to participate in, see what I can learn.
Who's next? We're on a roll now. Who's back?
Hi, I'm Judy Broken, and I'm also from the Washington area. Grew up in a time when it was just fun going to demonstrations. We were involved with demonstrations for civil rights, but partially because of the music and the fun and the camaraderie. So I'm the 60th generation. I'm a teacher at Western High School, so I'm very immersed in African American culture. I taught at City College. I've been involved with BLEWS for a really long time because I was involved with the first youth initiative, back when we had a big meeting at Morgan University when I was at City. And now my students are involved in a partnership with Shoshana Carden School. And we're going into our second year and our second group as well. So I feel like I've just been involved in the culture, in both cultures. And I've always believed that our strength is when we unite. We have so much in common that there's just no need to separate ourselves into groups at all.
My name is LaVon Zell Nicholson, and I work for the Maryland Food Bank. I am not originally from Baltimore either. And this is year number 6 for me. It's very interesting. I'm a Southerner, much like Keith there, and from the Deep South, and where there has not been a lot of diversity from the town that I'm from. And when I moved to Baltimore, the striking thing was, 1, the diversity of the community, and 2, the cohesiveness of neighborhoods. And so I've been doing a lot of work for the past couple of years, really around anti-poverty work and kind of grassroots community initiatives, one of which was Park Heights community. And so from that learning experience and the dynamics there was kind of my background. And that really piqued my interest for joining this. I just want to learn a lot and see kind of what's the next step in the social advocacy role for me.
Wonderful. How many native Baltimoreans do we have? Let's get this out of the way. All right, great. Who's next? Who wants to go next? Yes, ma'am.
My name is Linda Leffman, and I am a native Baltimorean, probably one of the senior members of the group. I became aware of this because since July I've become co-president of my temple, which is Temple Emmanuel. And our Rabbi Emeritus, Rabbi Gustav Buchdahl, was phenomenally active in the area of social action. Unfortunately, over the years, the level of involvement of our temple has somewhat declined. And when I saw something on our temple website, and I found something in my mailbox at temple about this organization, I took it into our rabbi, who is now Batsheva Meiri. And I said to her, you know, I have lots of time now because I just retired about a month and a half ago. And I said, I think that this is something I would really like to be involved in. I lived in, when my parents moved to Baltimore back in the late 30s, they originally lived in Windsor Hills. And then we moved to Northwest Baltimore. I went to an elementary school on Rogers Avenue, Arlington Elementary School, which is still there. My father was in merchandising at Hutzler Brothers, which many of you probably have never heard of, because it was a family-owned department store that went the way that most did. But one of the things that always struck me from the time that I was a very little girl, and of course at that time there was segregation in Baltimore, and I just could never understand why. And if I live to be 100 years old, I'll never understand why. At the risk of sounding very trite, to me, I couldn't understand it because the people that we associated with through my dad's work were African American. My parents had friends who were African American, and it just blew my mind that there were these stereotypes. But then I also, having grown up in a fairly diverse community, could never understand all the stereotypes that were associated with those of us who were Jews. And throughout my working career, I was always in a very mixed population. I live in an apartment community now in Pikesville, and I would say it's probably predominantly African American, although not entirely, because there are a number of certainly Caucasians there, but I'm noticing more and more Orientals and more people of Indian ethnicity. But the one thing that I wanted to do in getting involved was to be able to bring back information to the temple membership, and I was particularly impressed when I was reading the information about BLEWS that there are opportunities for the school populations to become involved, and I thought this would be something marvelous for our religious school.
Thank you so much. Great. Who's next?
Okay. I'm Ryness Baxter. I'm not from here either. I'm from New Haven. I'm from New Haven, Connecticut. Baltimore was definitely a culture shock, but not because of culture and race, because it's about as diverse in New Haven as it is here. I just thought Baltimore was just weird.
And you were right.
But I'm still here. So I've been here for 7 years. I'm a social worker at Department of Social Services and Foster Care. So I deal with about everyone, everything, you name it, I've seen it. I became drawn to blues because I do want to do work in a community, and I know it is really relevant that there are a lot of issues with race and culture, not just between black people and the Jewish people, but with everybody. But I feel as though so many people complain, I want to be a voice. And if somebody does say something, I want to be like, well, here, X, Y, and Z. So it just be part of the solution versus the problem of everybody trying to bring it down and make it seem like it's not okay. Plus, just to network and meet other people, because I feel as though amongst the group of people I know, it's kind of like everybody's kind of doing the same thing or kind of similar. So I want to meet people, other people.
Great. Who's next?
My name is Alan Rubenstein. When I was 15, I was asked to play piano for an AME Zion church with all these girls that were showing off their clothes. And I played this show, and it was just very unusual. It wasn't something I had ever experienced before. But I found that there was a tie, because there was some of the music that I was choosing for them to march to was taken from a lot of the civil rights types of songs that were done in the 1960s. I was trying to find things that they would be enjoying, things they were hearing on the radio. And then after the show, they were going to sanctify the food. Okay, there was a big spread of food. They said, Alan, why don't you play something or sing something to sanctify this food? And something from your Jewish background, and on the spot, I don't do very well on the spot. And I decided to sing the Kiddush. Okay, so the Kiddush is a Jewish sanctification of the wine. And I've never, to this day, ever heard the Kiddush sang that way with all these antiphonal responses, hallelujah, everything, each step of the way. So that was my introduction to becoming familiar with the African American community. I grew up on Long Island in a very segregated white community, which was very true to many of the communities in Nassau County and Suffolk County, near New York City. And so my exposure to African American issues didn't start until college. And each step of the way, I found that I was very drawn, especially to the music and the theater, which is my profession. I serve as a artist and educator for many of the schools and youth organizations, doing theater and music types of assemblies. I also serve as the cantor for Bolton Street Synagogue, which is here within the city limits on Cold Spring Lane. And my hope is I'd like to explore how the music and the theater and the cultural aspects can draw people together, because my experience has shown that in the arts, there isn't any color. It seems people, no matter what their backgrounds are, have something that they can share with right away. And it's the discipline or the beauty of that culture that draws people to learn something about each other. And I see that as a great tool that maybe blues can use, and I would like to see how I might be able to network and see how I can utilize that, especially in Howard County where I live, where I see lots of opportunity in that community for African Americans and Jews.
Who's next?
My name is Peter Brooks, and I think for a living. And I have a bank account which will show that thoughts are really only worth about. No, I'm between jobs. I'm a communications professional. I think that groups like this, dialogues like this, are extremely important. I was reflecting on Coretta Scott King and how I think African Americans are in such a pivotal position, an ideal position, if you will, to play the role of peacemakers in the current conflict between, say, Jews and Islam, or even the United States and Islam. That we have the ability to go between, and I think the more we understand about each other. Because one thing that the readings didn't really point out is the fact that these two groups are two of the most stereotyped groups, easily stereotyped. And so we're all very sensitive to that, and that's something we share in common. So, and we know that the only way to defeat stereotypes is through learning, understanding, listening. Thank you.
Who's next? Reed?
I'm Edgar Reed. I'm the director of the office, the Governor's Office of Community Initiatives at PHR. I'm also staff chaplain at the University of Maryland Medical System, Shock Trauma. I've been a member of the Blues for quite some time, dues-paying and active member, and I would like to become more active, and so that's why I'm here.
Great. Who's next? Rachel?
Okay. My name is Rachel Friedman, and I'm completely new to Blues. I'm new to the Baltimore Jewish community. I'm from Columbia, Maryland, and I just started working at Temple Oheb Shalom up there. I don't recall how I found out about Blues. I think it was a conversation that I somehow overheard with my parents or someone that was involved. I don't remember. They told me about it. It sounded really cool, so I wanted to be a part of it. I work with youth. In my current role, I work with Jewish youth, and that's with Temple Oheb Shalom, but I don't know exactly where I am career-wise. People tell me throughout their lives that they're in the same place I am, but I don't know. For me, it feels a little different. I graduated from college last year, and I'm not sure quite what I'm doing, but I know that whatever I do, my experiences here will really help me enrich my interactions with the people I work with.
I think we have, what, 2 or 3 more folks?
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Charles Sidler. I am from Baltimore. Went to Baltimore Polytechnic. Went to Johns Hopkins University with a degree in history. University of Maryland, Baltimore County with a degree in Master's in Public Policy Sciences, and University of Maryland Law School. Currently, I work at an organization called Enterprise Community Partners, which is a public charity located out in Columbia, Maryland. It used to be called the Enterprise Foundation. It was founded by Jim and Patty Rouse. So I work in their general counsel's office. Been there since 2001. I've heard about Blues some time ago, but this particular program was just brought to my attention probably about a month or 2 ago. And again, as everyone else had mentioned, I thought it would be a good opportunity to expand my network, talk to a number of different people, get some insight into some of the things that I do as some early pertinent world issues, things that I don't necessarily understand. I mean, talking about the conflict going on over in the Middle East, I mean, it doesn't make sense to me. So, I mean, I could look to this group, I mean, just to get some diversity of opinions on how other people feel about the conflict. And I guess that's about it.
Good. That's good. All right. Yes, ma'am.
Hi, good evening. My name is Ariel Harry Bess. I actually originally from the Caribbean, St. Vincent the Grenadines, so I'm definitely not a native. But I went to Loyola College, and Baltimore City has been my home since then. I'm active with the Young Democrats of Maryland, and I'm currently an attorney with Aegon Insurance here in the city also. I just found out about Blues about 2 months ago from a Maryland alum. And I'm here just to understand the issues and become part of the solution.
We have 2 folks left, right? Oh, come on.
Good evening. My name is Leah Abrams. I am a Sarbanes-Oxley compliance analyst for Agilon Community Consulting. I've been doing actually 6 months. Prior to that, I was in public accounting. I am a board member of BLEWS, and I am here to support and also to learn and network and expand my circle. That's it.
I'm Jeff Raymond, and whatever I have to say is not nearly as interesting as what those gentlemen have to say, so I'm going to shut up.
Did we get everyone? Well, we thank all of you for sharing so honestly and so openly, and I'm sure you all are equally as impressed as we were when we reviewed the applications. And again, we welcome you to this leadership program, and there is an ambitious agenda set for this evening, so I'll turn it back over to Matthew and we'll get started. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, I think you should all have the sense now, if you didn't already, that you will probably and hopefully learn as much from each other in the course of the next 6 months as you will learn from the various distinguished panel members that we'll have on the various topics of the next 6 months. I think we have a very interesting group that brings a lot of great commitment to the concerns of blues, as well as great background and experiences that we'll all get a lot out of. As you know from the program schedule that you've seen and that's in your binder, we have a terrific set of programs. We don't yet have all the exact dates and locations for some of the later ones yet, but we're going to be covering a tremendous breadth of different topics, from the structures of power and how blacks and Jews fit into that in the Baltimore area, to development issues and healthcare, politics, and education, and so many different subjects. But we wanted to start out tonight with something broader. And we wanted to start out tonight with sort of the big overall issues of black-Jewish relations, specifically in the Baltimore area. And we are delighted that we were able to bring before you this evening such an incredibly experienced and powerful and really rich group of panel members who have lived the experience of black-Jewish relations in the Baltimore region over the last generation or two. And so I'm going to ask the panel members to come forward now to take your seats, and I will take the honor of introducing our moderator. Marc Steiner is someone who we are all, of course, very familiar with, and has someone who has been many things in the course of his life, from a civil rights activist to a public school teacher, and of course, as we all know him, most recently, someone who has brought intelligent discussion of public issues and to our community in Baltimore, and who has now also led the effort to bring public broadcasting to Baltimore in a new and dynamic and very local and committed way. And so we have had the honor of having Marc Steiner work with BLEWS on many occasions. His commitment to black-Jewish relations and to community relations and human relations in general is unmatched in our community. So we're delighted that he's here tonight to run the panel discussion.
My pleasure to be here. Good evening. Introduce the panel. I need very little introduction. To my right is, of course, Mayor Schmoke, now Dean Schmoke, Dean of Howard Law School. I served our city as mayor for a long time. And I had the honor of actually, should I say this in public? We went to Cuba together and had a chance. It was in 1999, I think, but certainly that just before you left office. A triple number of mayors around the country, and that was an experience for us. The Honorable George Russell was next to him. George Russell also needs no introduction, one of the great civil rights leaders of our community, and a former judge in our court system. I also know him, actually not really know Judge though well, but his son and my daughter actually dated for a while in high school. I don't know what that makes us at all, but close but no cigar. Close but no cigar, exactly. That makes that. And of course, Judge Russell is. I always think I do see him every day. This is a cartoon I have on my wall from your first campaign when you ran for mayor in 1970. The original cartoon of you running for mayor. You sit there every day above my desk. And Rabbi Floyd Herman, of course, is the Rabbi Emeritus of Har Sinai Congregation, very active in our community, has been in civil rights and human rights work and work between black and Jewish communities for a long time, one of the venerated leaders of the Jewish community. I was just on my show recently, actually, the last man came in and helped us pull off our Hanukkah special. Without him, we wouldn't have done it. And next to him is Matthew Crenson, Professor of Political Science at Johns Hopkins University, also a frequent guest on my show, who has written a great deal about the politics of our nation. And I guess at least three of us are people who experienced Baltimore City College. Matt, you were there before me, and I was there before Kurt.
Yeah, it was a very long time.
So we're going to begin this by everybody on the panel will give a brief introduction and thoughts about Black-Jewish relations. And I'll throw out one or two questions that I think are kind of appropriate for the evening. And then have all of you please join this conversation and really talk about some, what I think are some very serious issues. I think that we sometimes, in our, one of a better term, our goodness, people who are very active in civil rights, very active in progressive communities, kind of don't always venture into, because Jewish and Black relations beyond the echelon sometimes can be very sticky, and are very sticky. And we'll talk about some of those during the course of the evening as well, I hope. But let's start. We'll just go down rather than...
I want to defer to Matt, because he's got a context, I think.
Does he have a context?
I have
he wrote something.
Prepared.
That's right. You're better than the rest of us.
Well, there's reason prepared, because I had to.
Go ahead.
Because it appears that I'm the white Gentile.
You are.
And I'm not surprised. I knew we would be a minority someday. Dangerous. I have to say I was rather uncertain about what plans you had for me this evening. So I called or emailed Matthew Weinstein and asked him what I might contribute to the discussion here in view of the fact that I was neither Black nor Jewish. He acknowledged both of those deficiencies and advised me, I think wisely, to stick to the political science, because that's what I knew better, presumably, about being Black or Jewish. I think that was pretty good advice, and I'm going to stick to it with one minor exception. The readings that we had for this evening, the assignment we had about Black-Jewish relations in general, from a global perspective, even with its international dimensions. But I want to talk about the little picture. I want to talk about Baltimore. I want to speak to you not just as a political scientist, but as a political scientist who also happens to be a native Baltimorean, so that I can perhaps be both parochial and board at the same time. I prepared for this evening, and you can see that I needed to prepare, by Googling Black Jewish organizations on the internet. I used a variety of different search strategies. My wife is a librarian. Partly to find out how many other organizations out there like this. There were locally based organizations. It was partly just to confuse the National Security Agency. I may have missed some organizations like this one. But I thought it's a very rare group. The closest counterpart to this is an organization in Atlanta that was formed in 1982, an effort to campaign for the renewal of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Other than that, there aren't very many. There's a small leadership group in Philadelphia that formed in the 1990s. Other than that, the only one that I found was an organization in Seattle that hasn't been around nearly as long as this one. And although the website didn't include any membership statistics, I'm guessing that when African Americans and Jews get together in Seattle, it's not a large group. not the kingdom. The only other record I found was an informal alliance between a Black church and a synagogue in Olney, which is just west of the city and therefore part of the cultural hinterland of Baltimore. So Baltimore has the longest established Black Jewish organization, locally based organization. And if the number of hits on the internet is any indicator, it's also one of the best known and most active in the country. So it appears that intergroup collaborations like this one between African Americans and Jews has a lot of Baltimore. I can't say exactly why that is. But my guess is that Baltimore offers more opportunities for Black Jewish collaboration in other cities. But perhaps also that there's more frequent need for it here. And I suspect that the need and the opportunity both stem from the same circumstance. My impression, and it's been confirmed by what a lot of you have been saying here this evening, is in Baltimore, both groups have higher levels of internal diversity, heterogeneity, disjointedness, and even internal contention than the groups do in other cities. One implication of that is that there's a wider range of opinion and expression within each of these groups, which increases the likelihood that there's always going to be somebody in each group who's giving offense to somebody in the other. At the same time, that same internal diversity creates more opportunity for communication and cooperation between Black and Jewish communities. Now, I didn't just use Google to prepare for this evening. I actually went out and did research because I was the only one here who really needed to do research. I can't tell you everything I found in 10 minutes, but let me just give you a sample. It's well known that from about 1810 up to the Civil War, Baltimore had the largest collection, largest concentration of free Black people in the United States. By 1860, over 90% of the African Americans living in Baltimore were free people. One consequence of that was that Black Baltimoreans were free to form their own independent community institutions a lot earlier than Black people in other cities. For example, the first private Black school, it was the only kind there were, called an African Academy. The first private Black school in Baltimore was founded in 1802. The first independent Black church congregation that was able to locate was founded in 1815. There was also a Black labor union, a Black bank, a Black-owned shipyard. Even before they got the right to vote in 1870, Black Baltimoreans had already organized to lobby the state legislature to protect themselves from discriminatory legislation, and they succeeded. So by the time they did get the right to vote under the 15th Amendment, they were already politically organized. And that probably meant that there were multiple power bases in the Black community organized around different churches, different organizations. In other words, rival leaders with distinct organizational constituencies. And that fragmenting tendency was aggravated, magnified by the fact that a whole new Black population came into Baltimore during and after World War II, mostly from the Carolinas. One result of that is that Black Baltimoreans have had a difficult time achieving political unity. One symptom was that they had a considerable problem uniting behind one candidate for mayor. I think Mr. Russell knows something about this. It was famously pamphlet by the late G. Arthur Fleming, G. James Fleming of Morgan State University, why Baltimore didn't elect a Black mayor in 1971. I'm sure Mr. Russell can tell you a lot about that. It's also the reason why Baltimore, later than most other cities with a Black majority, was very late to elect its first Black mayor. So there's a lot of diversity within the Black community in Baltimore. And those political and other divisions were also evident in the mayoral election of 1999 here. Several splits among them. So Baltimore has its history, Black Baltimore has a history of internal divisions and subgroups. And it turns out the same is true of Jewish Baltimore. In 1899, in East Baltimore alone, where there was an Eastern European Jewish population of about 1,000, there was a total of 20 synagogues. That's about one synagogue for every 50 people. There was a synagogue just for people from the Yala South. There was a synagogue just for people from a town in Lithuania I've never heard of. Now, I'm told that this is not entirely unusual, but what is unusual about Baltimore, according to my informants, has been the durability of the division in Baltimore between German Jews and Eastern European Jews. And I suspect there are two reasons for this. First of all, Baltimore was a German town, where at the turn of the century there were still 7 elementary schools where instruction was given, public schools, in German. Not only that, but I've just finished reading a very interesting paper about the domestic life of German Jews in Baltimore, which says that many of the Jewish families actually sent their children to private Lutheran schools so that they could maintain their proficiency in German. They hired German Gentile servants, so the German could be the spoken language in the house. And so Baltimore's German Jews maintained their linguistic distinctiveness for much longer than people elsewhere. Henrietta Soule, one of the most famous Baltimore's Jewish community, wrote a letter to her mother saying that even though she was raised in speaking English, she preferred German because it was more gemütlich than it was, than English was. So German Jews remained somewhat distinct from Russian and Polish-speaking Jews in Baltimore. They were also segregated from white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. My colleague Benjamin Ginsberg, who's written about anti-Semitism, tells me that German Jews were very easily accepted into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elites of San Francisco and New York. But that didn't happen in Baltimore. In the first place, the white Anglo-Saxon elite in Baltimore didn't amount to very much around the turn of the century. By 1900, this was already a branch office town. There were no Mellons here, there were no Leland Stanfords, no Rockefellers, no Vanderbilts. So the wealthy elite families didn't want to break into the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite. It wasn't that respectable. And perhaps because they were uncertain about their status, the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants didn't want to let them in either. We all know the stories about the restrictive covenants that were supposed to have kept not only African Americans, but Jews out of nice Gentile neighborhoods. Recent research by a University of Maryland law professor named Garrett Power suggests that it wasn't really the restrictive covenants, that it was much more subtle things. For example, one eminent Jewish family, Julius Levy's, the straw hat manufacturer Levy's, actually built a house in Roland Park. They said the neighbors didn't show any overt hostility, but the milkman, the newspaper boy, and the bakery delivery man wouldn't have anything to do with it. I suspect that they had to be organized to do that. So the point is that both black Baltimore and Jewish Baltimore are internally divided, fragmented, diverse. Much more so than you're likely to find in other cities, much more than I can explain to you in just a few minutes. And as I said, that gives greater likelihood of giving offense to the other group. But since the offenders tend to be small subgroups, the offenses tend to be relatively small too, and involve entire communities. That makes them easier to manage. And the same internal diversity is present in both the black and Jewish community. Also makes, as I said, makes it much easier to collaborate, to cooperate, and to communicate. Those are the resources that I think you have to work with. What you face most immediately, I suppose, is the challenge of statewide competition between black and Jewish candidates and some local competition as well. I'm sure more about that. I think, though, on the basis of what I can find out, that you have reason for optimism. And if I've offended anybody, I hope I've done it to all of you equally.
In terms of Judge Washington.
Well, I'm really disturbed about the conditions that exist in Baltimore City today. I was in the legislature, for instance, last week testifying on the expungement of records of people who were arrested, photographed, fingerprinted, and released. Over 81,000 citizens of the city of Baltimore were arrested and released without charges, thereby tainting that record for that individual. A lot of them are young people. The common thing among all of them is that they were poor. And this type of lawless law enforcement is rampant in Baltimore City. And it has a tremendous effect on the community. You know, when I think about the blues, I think about a dear friend of mine, Jack Levin, who I think was one of the originators of this organization. And at that time, of course, all of us now have gray hair, and some of us have no hair. But historically, this group was central to better racial relations in Baltimore. Another institution in the city now has totally collapsed, and that's our educational system. We here at the museum, under the leadership of Dr. Nancy Drasnick, for the first time in the nation, we have a curriculum on African American history of Maryland. And it's been written, approved, and copyrighted in every public school in the state. And it's not being utilized in Baltimore City. Instead, they're utilizing the Studio One and other magazines that are just totally inappropriate. So I mention that because when you take that in the context of Katrina, which exposed the underbelly of American society and demonstrated clearly the classism that exists in America, where 80% of the population is losing money every year, their income is decreasing, 20% is increasing, and they get the tax breaks. This not only applies to poor blacks, it's poor whites, the elderly, the disabled. The national budget was cut. They cut student loans, Medicare, Medicaid, and things that are so necessary for the community. And this has had an effect because, you know, we don't have the Kirk Schmokes, Clarence Blunts, Pete Rawlins, and the other intelligent leaders to communicate with. We have a different set of group of leaders, and it makes it difficult. So we have some problems in Baltimore City that we have to confront ourselves before we can begin addressing, communicating with other ethnic groups. But it's very important that those of us who are able continue the dialogue. And I think that with the continuation of this unique organization, it augurs well for the future, despite all of the hardships and handicaps that the community has to overcome.
Thank you. Judge Russell. Rabbi Floyd Herman.
It's hard, thank you. It's hard for me to, as I thought about this today, and I didn't write anything about, it's hard for me to sort of focus on, you don't want to hear the history. I was interested in all of you telling your stories. Just tell you that I grew up in Mississippi, in a totally segregated society, completely segregated, separate water fountains, separate waiting rooms. That was the world that I knew. Obviously, that began to change in the 60s. By the 60s, I had left Mississippi and gone off to college. But I think that my involvement in the movement in the 60s, in the late 60s, middle and late 60s, did influence me. I've only been in Baltimore 25 years, so I'm not a native. I think everybody else up here is. But I couldn't help but think today about 1968, with the death of Coretta King and the publication of Taylor Branch's third volume in a wonderful work. I couldn't help but think about 1968 and the changes that wrought. I was living in Houston in 1968. There were riots in Houston just like there were riots in Baltimore and every other city. And I think what it did to the Jewish community, let me say a word about the Jewish community. I think what it did to the Jewish community, which we have not overcome in all those years, is that it brought to the fore Jewish racism. And we like to think that it doesn't exist anymore, but it does. It's still there. And people will tell you, oh, my grandfather lost his store in East Baltimore in 1968. Well, that was 1968. The world has changed in remarkable ways since 1968. But some of that racism is still very much a part of the community. I'm not proud to say that, but very much a part of the community of which I've tried to lead, and others in this room have tried to lead in the years that I've been here. I would also say that in thinking about 1968 and what Dr. King was doing when he was assassinated, and what George has said, the two things that never get separated, at least in my mind, and that we can't separate, are race and economics. The issue of poverty is just an overwhelming issue, I think, in Baltimore. I'm involved in, now that I'm retired, in trying to do some work for community and investment and redevelopment in Baltimore City. There's some great neighborhoods in this community which are starting to come back, maybe hopefully, but need some reinvestment money and need for people of diverse populations to move into what is wonderful housing stock. Yeah, it needs to be upgraded, but it's terrific housing stock. But the question I keep asking the people I'm involved in is, there are poor people living there now. Where are they going to go? I don't get very good answers, I must say. And so I think that you can't separate race and poverty. And as George said, New Orleans certainly pointed that out. But I said after Katrina, you know, that could have happened in Baltimore or Cleveland or Detroit or any other major city in this country. And that's what we need to work on. And I'm optimistic because I see people like you, and I know my friends here, but it's a huge task.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Well, I was pleased to hear Matt's presentation because I thought it gave us some context to talk about these matters because there really are several Jewish communities and several black communities in Baltimore. And also, as we're talking about Baltimore, we've got to define whether we're talking about the city or the region. If we're talking about the metropolitan area, that's a very different picture than if we're talking about the city. When you look, I understand a lot of my prism on this is politics, But if you look at the city from a political point of view, you're talking about a majority African American voting community. You step right outside the city lines, and all of a sudden you're talking about African Americans as a very, very distinct minority in terms of political power. The other thing, someone mentioned moving up to Baltimore and looking at our communities. I think it said either the integrity of neighborhoods or bottom line is that we're one of the most segregated cities in America and have been for years and years. And so I would say that while all of us have individual stories of very good relations between blacks and Jews individually, whether it's business or friendships, or that as communities, I think describing the community relationships is that historically the Black-Jewish relations were warm and distant, and now they are civil and distant. That the warmth went off of the relationship, as Rabbi Herman said, after 1968. And I think in some respects, again, looking just politically at a specific marker, if you would look in when Perrin Mitchell ran against Sam Friedel in the early 70s, this was a symbolic statement of an African American taking over a congressional district that had been represented by a Jewish representative, congressman for so long. That was politically, it was a real break. And it started to change the political dynamics in the community, and then there were many other things that occurred later. But I think that the story, though, is still filled with more good news than bad news. The one other problem, though, that we have real difficulty, and what Mr. Russell was trying to explain with this whole curriculum issue, our school system has just been so incredibly segregated for so long. I mean, we had about 15 years of a transition. In 1955, we integrated the schools. By 1970, the school system had almost resegregated. Pockets in the elementary grades of integrated schools, but overall, the high schools, the middle schools had become resegregated by 1970-71 and continued in that range. So the young people didn't get to grow up with one another. They didn't have the kind of interaction that many young people had in that 55 to 1970 period, and that too has stamped the relations, and that's why I'm pleased that the BLEWS have made such an effort to go with the youth initiative and outreach. That has been so important to get young people meeting and talking to one another again, because without that we will go for another generation with the distance getting even broader.
Thank you all. And let me just throw this out to you, and when I would participate in this, that some of the things the four of you have touched on. And when the BLEWS began, this organization, I remember the beginning of this organization. I wasn't the founder of it, but I went to meetings, and I went to a lot of meetings in the late 70s and 80s. When this organization was founded, we were coming out of a period where there were a lot of Jews who were involved in the civil rights movement. There was an interaction that happened between the black and Jewish community, just by the nature of, at that point in the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, blacks and Jews were both, in very different ways, minorities of America, faced discrimination. There was an empathy out of the Jewish parts of the Jewish community because of that, because of the segregation and the anger about racism in America. People could pull, and there was the Holocaust, and Jews remember what happened very recently. You know, some of us even grew up with victims of the Holocaust victims in our homes. And so all of that kind of lent itself to an interaction and a uniting around the number of issues between certain elements in the black and Jewish community. And I wonder how relevant that is now. I was thinking about what you all would. The black and Jewish worlds have parted ways so much over the last 10 years, where the interaction is left for a certain group, but for the most part pretty separate, that there has to be some kind of agenda to think about rather than the old agenda of black-Jewish relations that might be something of the past.
Well, I just want to tell you one aside on that, and with the fighting poverty issue. You know, when I was in office, we decided to go after this empowerment zone initiative of the Clinton administration to try to do something in neighborhoods, and we designed a plan which got implemented in 3 different neighborhoods in the city. And the plan was based on a trip that the Baltimore Jewish Jewish Council sent me on with a group of citizens that go meet Ted Kollek in Jerusalem. And we looked at Project Renewal sites in Jerusalem and Kiryat Gat, a much smaller city in Israel, came back with these plans and started implementing them. And we did a lot of new housing and renovating schools and things like that. So we had this whole little, you know, project renewal sites and everything. And we tried to talk about that as a new variation on black-Jewish relations. Really, nobody wanted to hear about it. Again, we had gotten, there was so much distance that it was, and Wendell talked about it a little bit also with the magazines, with Baltimore magazines. You talk about race, and nobody wants to talk about those issues. And so it was easier just to kind of push it aside and say, oh, that was a nice trip they took. But I was saying, hey, here's a great example of, in the 80s and 90s, of a close working relationship between the black community and Jewish community to do something about poverty in Baltimore, and that just went right below the radar.
Matt, you're about to say something.
Yeah, I think that goes back a long way. It's not just recent. I think there's been a reluctance to talk about race in general that goes back quite a distance. One of the leaders of the Jewish community in Baltimore, Walter Sondheim, was president of the Board of School Commissioners, who made that decision to integrate the schools. They didn't have to do it. They could have, the Supreme Court had handed down the first part of the Brown decision, but the second part hadn't come down yet, the way how to implement it. But the Baltimore City Board of School Commissioners, in the space of about 2 weeks, made a decision immediately to integrate the schools. And it's an organization at that time was dominated by members of the Baltimore Jewish community, and they were being responsive to what they thought were demands of racial justice. Ironically, it seems to me, the effect of that decision, very little public discussion, and little discussion in the court, was to cut off the discussion of race. The issue was resolved, and Baltimore, which had been very compliant with federal law, just got to sit still for 15 years as planned. We didn't go anywhere in integration until the early 1970s, by the time it was too late. I went in 1954 from a legally segregated elementary school to a legally integrated junior high school, called, ironically, Robert E. Lee School. And it was a very enlightening experience for me. It was the first time I'd gone to a racially integrated public school. Nobody, no teacher, no principal, no vice principal, no counselor ever said a word to us about what was going on. And I think that's classic Baltimore. You just don't like to talk about it. And I think that's what this group can start to do, is to begin the discussion.
Look at George Floyd, right to the audience here.
Well, I just had some thoughts. I believe that the attempt to integrate this public school destroyed it. During segregation, many of the teachers could not go to the University of Maryland, and they all received $5,000 to go to any university they want because they couldn't go to Maryland. I remember when I finished law school, they wouldn't permit me to take a bar review course. I had to study on my own. along with the other black members, well, the two others. But instead, these teachers, Columbia and New York University, came to Baltimore at Douglas High School and taught the teachers, and they were all getting masters and PhDs. And when integration came, those highly qualified teachers were put in the white schools, and the black schools got the least qualified white teachers. And that, in my judgment, began to decline because the cohesiveness of segregation, as wrong as it was, but everybody knew everyone, I know, and the knowledge of each other in the community enabled the community to set high moral standards, and everyone would look out for each other. When integration came, all of that was gone, and now we don't have that kind of cohesiveness that is required for a community to succeed. But most of all is that there's no standard of moral accountability that's mutually accepted. And once you do not believe in God, what other mutuality is there for you? And I believe that's primarily the primary source of the disintegration in the African American community. And but this organization is vital if we are to have any hope in regards to the intergroup relations. And I applaud you for persevering on these terrible conditions, particularly conditions of poverty that exist. And it's difficult to talk to a person who's poor, has a little education, and they don't know where the next meal is coming from, and that's pervasive. I look at East Baltimore with Johns Hopkins expanding. That's fine for Johns Hopkins. Where do those people go? Where do they go? When they close the block, where do those people go? And so what it is, it's the neighborhoods becoming deteriorated, and it's a real problem. And as I said, this is just reflective of what Katrina demonstrated. Now, I keep emphasizing Katrina because we saw the literature from the economists in London, from Italy, all of the European countries, all over the world, at once found out our dirty little secret here in America. And the economists, this is Pete Angelos brought this back, they had a lady in the water, and it had New Orleans, and at the top is the shame of America. And so we have a great deal to overcome, but we have to start within our own community and attempt to teach the history. You can't go forward if you don't know your history. And these kids out here have no concept of slavery, and indeed, in some states, American history is taught from Reconstruction forward. Nothing about slavery is taught. And one of the things in the course that was introduced, we had in Baltimore County, at Lock Raven School, was 85% white. And those kids were discussing slavery, why the slaves ran, why they escaped. They had a big quotation, Reverend Harold Carter there. And once I saw these white kids interacting about slavery, they were excited. And, but yet we can't get it in Baltimore City, where it's needed. This is what these kids need to understand, their own history and their own legacy.
I'm surprised to hear you say that, talk about the lack of faith. The black community is supposed to be the largest church-going community in the country. I don't know if that's changed. And I think that one of the things that probably ought to be discussed at some point is the relationship between black churches and synagogues, which has a kind of a checkered relationship in many ways. There have been great programs. Steve Forstenser mentioned a program that we had at Har Sinai and Brown's Memorial when Doug Miles was the pastor there. Doug left, everything changed. It became a different congregation. The people became different. They weren't interested in continuing that kind of dialogue. I think as far as the schools are concerned, my impression of what's happened in Baltimore City, not having grown up there, is that the overwhelmingly vast private school system here, which I have never experienced anywhere else that I've ever lived in my life, has been perhaps, I will put it, it's a two-edged sword. It may be one of the greatest benefits of living in this city because they produce brilliant kids. I think it has been unbelievably detrimental to the city schools. You don't have people like these three people. Yeah, you do. I mean, City College is still a great school, but is it the same caliber?
All due respect to your high school.
Well, those three. Poly Western and City are great. But I mean, I don't know the answer. Are the caliber of kids there the same as Mark and Kurt?
Yes.
And Matt?
But the problem is that from back in the middle 1960s, we had 4 or 5 very strong high schools, and today we've got 4 or 5 very strong high schools, and then the rest of the high school system is weak, and that's probably, and the private schools have probably become more integrated than the public schools.
Yeah, I think they are.
Sure. Folks, I'm going to let you, the first hand up was way back.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to ask a very difficult question, and so Professor Crenson, I'll need your kind of moral support here. You know, it's an interesting concept. I mean, if the Jews had not gotten involved with the civil rights movement to the level that they did, and I'm kind of dovetailing on your question, Mark, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. And I was just curious, if something similar to the Holocaust were to take place here and now, you know, where would African Americans stand?
The Holocaust for whom?
For Jews. If Jews were being removed from this area slowly but surely, or something like that, or not even Jews, but any, you know, would African Americans stand up for Jews in the same way that Jews had stood up for African Americans? It's just throwing that out there.
You're also talking about visible Jews, but not that many. Read Taylor's books. Yes, there were very important people. The NAACP would not have gotten started had it not been for, well, no, it's Sears, the guy that owns Sears, who put up a lot of the money, and a guy named Kivy Kaplan in Boston, who put up a lot of the money for that. But they were, it wasn't, I must be honest with you, it wasn't a mass movement of Jews. We know the names, you know, Goodman and Schwarter, we know the names, we know Heschel. But there were a lot of Jews who either sat on the sidelines and sat on their hands or said, this is going to change my world.
The vast majority of whites in the civil rights movement.
There were a larger percentage of Jews in the civil rights movement than the part of the general
population. But Taylor points out that the blacks, too, weren't that many.
That's correct, yeah.
But I think that the question he asked, I mean, if you twist it around, I got emails today that I was going to bring with me, but actually rushed out and forgot them. But I got a number of emails about this. When you talk about the issue where it is today, maybe people can honestly talk about this for a minute. I mean, if you go outside this room, and people, similar to people in this room, the email had to do with the rumor about the uproar that never happened, but became a rumor, a living rumor, an urban legend, recently at Mount Washington Elementary School, where certain Jews in the school, parents were alleged to use the N-word. And that actually came out of another meeting with an elementary school in that area, where an older Jewish man was very upset because he was attacked by some young black kids, and said it was like the Holocaust, they're attacking us again. And so, but what that did was, and I'm on a couple of these email list conversations, and one of them has to be mostly African American, where every time it comes up, there's this anti-Semitism that flies out from this email group. And I'm always flying back to it, trying to counter it with some notions, but it's very real. And I think the same takes place in the Jewish world. I mean, I think that one of the things that we don't talk about a lot, is that beneath the surface of the great dialogue and cooperation that's happened in the liberal establishment, in the progressive establishment, and the black and Jewish leadership of this community, there's something else going on that we often don't want to talk about.
There are a couple of things. Steve Forcenter. First, in response to what you said, and what Floyd said, the mayor, there's not a lot of people. Du Bois said the talented 10. And he's not talking just about blacks. And if we're lucky, across the board, there are 10% of people who really give a damn about almost anything. Some of us in the union movement, some of us in the religious movement, but when you go and begin to talk to people, you know, I've got a couple of kids who are active in crazy things, and people say to me, why are they active in it? Why are they doing this? And they have friends who ask them the same questions I got asked in the 60s. Why are you involved in that? You're not really, you know, part of that. And that's a problem that we have to begin to talk about, and it's coming out here, but it brings both groups at loggerheads. And I think it was fascinating when the professor said that there were so many groups in both groups that it mitigated against any unity. Whether it's 50 synagogues or 50 churches. If you've got small power structures, people, especially if we perceive ourselves as outsiders, build our little walls around our own organization so we have some power somewhere. But to come back to the education thing, which is my question. Since integration, and more in this city than I've seen in any other place, why was it that the religious organizations were the ones that established segregated private schools? Why do we end up with Christian academies and some Jewish schools that were clearly set up so that we don't go with those folks anymore? It's a series, you know, where was religion in all of this?
It's a southern city. You think it's bad here. It is a southern city. It's definitely a southern city. When I came here from Chicago, I called my wife, and I grew up in the South. I said, Barbara, I feel like I'm home. People here don't sound like they do in Chicago. Go to Boston.
No, it is a southern city.
You know, I thought having this meeting here today, I mean, was right on point because of what had happened last Thursday with the lieutenant governors. And I thought, I was like, all right, I know we're going to talk about this.
Yeah, I can get that too.
So I'm surprised, I mean, it hasn't come up yet. And I was listening
Which
to
part? You mean this stem cell?
Right, this statement about stem cell research. So I mean, I read the comment and I listened to a Stephen dialogue and pontificated about on WBAL. And my reading of it was not the same as how it was interpreted by the media, but with that said, I also understand that the Jewish community, or many in the Jewish community, I'm not going to say all, but many in the Jewish community, they were offended about the comment, and I was hoping that we at least talk about it so that I could understand that what bothered people about it. And because I know many times when the view of things are that things are real tough, people will tend to compare it to the history of slavery, and it's that comparison that Holocaust, which is, I mean, that's how it was viewed by some blacks, that was our Holocaust. That comparison doesn't bother me. What I take from it is that person who is using that analogy is saying, look, this situation is so bad and hurting the community so much that I believe I can compare it to something that devastated a community. So I'm assuming that Michael Steele's and speaking of it the way that he did, he was saying, look, as a Roman Catholic, I have this belief that all life is precious, and to destroy it, I mean, it's akin to medical experimentation that was done back during the 1930s. So, I mean, I was hoping that we could talk about that a little bit.
think that that incident was magnified all out of context, particularly in the Sun papers, who are not very happy with the governor and Steele. I don't know Steele well. I've met him. He's a fine individual to want to meet. He may not agree with the orders, but man has a fine background. He's a very gentle person. And he made a mistake, and it was blown up. You know, incidentally, coming here, the Fourth Circuit upheld Governor Earl in his fight against the Sun papers. So I have to view that in the context of the politics that's going on. And but I don't think that there's any ill will in Steele's heart.
Now you mentioned politics. Are we talking about politics of the Sun and Republicans, or are we talking about politics in the context of the senatorial race?
Well, why don't we take it away from the politics for a second then? I mean, I think that one of the things that represented to me, and I'd see if you all think about that, what happened with and I think it fits into the Black-Jewish world and the white and black world, is that what it said to me was the sensitivity, and maybe sometimes ultra-sensitivity, that minorities have to statements that are made that they feel kind of strike something very deep inside of them, that they feel but can't always express. And that's part of what happens here. When you talk about the Holocaust, you talk about race on some levels, it erupts things in people that are almost inexplicable because they're just so deep-seated. I think that's part of what happens.
Yes, inartful, but I don't think.
Yeah, and the picture in the paper the next day, Mark, was of a bunch of politicians.
Yeah.
It was politicians who took the, I mean, because, and I think there needs to be a dialogue on that, and I don't know if this is the time to do it or not, but yeah, as soon as politicians get involved, no offense, Mr. Mayor, but
I'm an academic. I'm a recovering politician.
Well, you know, I mean, at least 80% of it, you just have to start discounting, and I would bring politics to what's happening with the reaction to the cartoon in the Muslim world. Greg Kane made some really smart, insightful comments today to give the Sun paper some credit. And it's just so important to remember when politicians get involved, it's just not necessarily reflective of what's happening.
There's always
right here.
Yeah, I think part of the problem is that as minority groups, we're always walking on eggshells. And I think that we always feel like we're under a microscope, in a sense. And when you were talking about the educational system, there was that uproar about Northwestern possibly closing. It's interesting that it isn't. But I went to some of the meetings of the Facility Solutions Committee, and the feeling was, if Northwestern were to close, why would Northwestern close? Was it the Jewish community that wanted the land? Any time that this comes up, we're just constantly walking under eggshells. And if I can just share with the last youth initiatives programs we had, one of the students from Western, we were talking about education, and they were talking about the fact that education should be started at a very young age, that it would be best to indoctrinate children at a very young age. And one of the young girls from Western said, well, it's like Hitler, the Nazis really had it right. And there was this in the room. Am I right? There was an audible gasp, and she looked around and said, what did I say? And all of a sudden, and we went over to her and said, it's not really good to say a good thing about the Nazis in a mixed audience with the Jewish. And she went like this and came over to me and said, can I go to the bathroom? And I said, are you coming back? And she said, no. And I said, then you're not going to the bathroom. And the other day she said to me, I don't know if I'm going to continue. And she's a Spanish student. I said to her, do you want to pass this class? You're continuing BLEWS. But it's that learning that we all have to do, and the comfort level and the trust that I think we have to have with each other. That's why I think this is important.
I think you're absolutely right. I remember when the mayor and I went to junior high school in Garrison, it was less critical time, and we used to sit down and talk to people. That's why this initiative is so valuable, and what Marlon is doing is so valuable. And I would tell them, there's some people we all know now, and I would go up to a Jewish student, I don't understand the Holocaust, and they'd explain the Holocaust and the feelings to me. and they'd ask me about slavery, and I would explain why certain things were sensitive to Black. And through that dialogue, I brought a sensitivity into my latter years that I don't see that exists now. And I think when I heard the comment about Steele, I said, well, you know, and having met him, he's with no vindictiveness. Politics interests, but what has happened, we have not learned to dialogue with each other and put an effort forward to learn about each other's pain and the history that we both have. We used to be able to do that so well.
You and Kurt, me and Bunch of us, grew up in a very rarefied atmosphere.
You learned there were smart kids and
very lucky.
dumb kids.
Very lucky.
Yeah.
Right.
Some of the dumb ones are very
They made all the money.
Yes, sir.
I would hope that in our discussions and dialogue, if it's going to be useful, that our focus is not so global in terms of Black and Jewish relationships, but really look at the historic relationships that were in Baltimore and the personalities that facilitated Black and Jewish relationships. And if you look closely at that, you'll see that those relationships were economic, that there was a sharing of resources and sharing of information that created the kind of blue. And we could point to early development in downtown Baltimore being relationships between the Jewish community and individuals and Black community. We could look at shopping center development and see that there was economic relationships. I think that we miss a clear opportunity as we move through the riots where the Jewish community kind of withdrew and the interaction then became totally different. I did graduate from high school in '69, so I did have the benefit of being in a multicultural situation. And so when I look, and I did have the opportunity in the latter part of the '70s to organize a coalition of churches in Baltimore City. And the missing element in that coalition was the Jewish community. There was Catholics, there were Protestants, there were Blacks, and we created a tremendous dynamic. But the Jewish community did not come into the mix. But inside of all of that, there were always those relationships, and I had tremendous friends that I would love to go meet with them and we'd talk, and they'd tell me tremendous kinds of stories about how things actually, what caused things to happen. And I think now, even if we look inside of this dynamic here, and particularly, I came here late, State Center planning, looking at McCullough homes. What happens to that community? I mean, and where's my Baltimore Hebrew Synagogue joining with my church to figure out how do we ensure that there's affordable housing in West Baltimore? I don't see that dialogue. And so, in some sense, you know, I was happy because the Lord blessed I could pay the $200, and I figured that maybe we'll have a good investment of my time and a good investment of my dollars. But when I leave this dialogue, I got to go on Drew Hill Avenue. And there's anger there. I mean, there's anger because people are looking at vacant housing that has been abandoned. There's anger because people see school systems that aren't educating. So, I mean, you know, I would hope that we talk, you know, really about the dynamic of Baltimore and not get caught in these side issues, because that's what's thrown us off. You know, and I think that we've not really understood. I mean, I look here at two of my key leaders, and they can talk about long-term political and economic relationships that were for the good, and I believe that's what we have to develop.
I think that that's a good focus. I'm not sure what the focus of this panel is, and I know you're going to have talks about economic development and the future of Baltimore and power and all the rest of that, and I think that's the focus. But to come back to your point, because I think it needs a comment. I don't think that anyone, I was in New York when this happened, so I heard about it from my wife and read about it in The Sun, which is not the best source of information, particularly about, well, about anything today. But that's another sad thing I want to tell you about Baltimore. When I came here, The Sun was one of the great newspapers in the country. It was still owned by the Abels. It was literate. It gave you the news? Well, that's another whole story. Thank God for Mark. But I don't think that anyone felt, I think that most of us did not feel that the Lieutenant Governor was malicious or mean in his comments, but he was insensitive. Because he used code words which push Jewish buttons. And there are code words which push black buttons. I can go home, I tell young couples that I'm counseling before we get married. I've been married almost 46 years. I can go home tonight and in 2 seconds I can pick a fight with my wife. So I know which buttons to push. I don't do that. Most of the time. And she can push my buttons as well. And I'm not suggesting that, that the Lieutenant Governor was trying to push buttons. I think that he spoke from the heart. He tried to relate it to the audience that he was talking to. He didn't come there to talk about that. It was a question asked by a friend of mine, not on the topic. He was there to talk about his trip to Israel. And he just thought that he was communicating something to the people who were there, but he pushed the wrong buttons. And I think we do that a lot. And that's probably what gets us in as much trouble on interpersonal relations and group relations as anything else. And maybe what this group needs to do is deal with some of those hot button issues and desensitize yourself about them.
And look at areas where we can develop positive relationships. Because I think one of the buttons he pushed in my hearing comment was the first word was, you folks.
Yeah.
You know, that's right away. This is too casual.
But I would just say to you, Rabbi, and I would say to you, my friend, that coming from my community, we appreciate the fact that there is an African American lieutenant governor, but the African American lieutenant governor does not speak for us.
No,
And I wonder why there is a reaction that would not cause us to dig deep into the core of the community to really talk to the people who really talk to people.
I mean, we don't want to talk about politics, but there's so much politics involved in that confrontation.
I'm talking about social.
You can't get rid of it. You just can't. I mean, I don't know if you want to go there, but that's a huge issue.
Can I finish on that?
I'm sorry.
Well, I mean, just
go ahead.
This is a regular kind of routine.
If you're going to, okay. Because mine's kind of a separate thing. I think one thing that's kind of interesting in terms of dialoguing among the cultures, for me, when you pointed out that there's a difference between German Jews and East Russian or Slavic. European, okay. See, I didn't know that. But I think for a Jewish person to ask an African American, is your family from North Carolina? I think that's kind of interesting because it starts me to talk about my history, you know what I mean? And I think it's very important for African Americans to study their genealogy because we're so cut off, which I think the Jewish community has a very strong, you know, you know what I'm saying, history and things that they can recount and stuff that we can't.
You just said, no, it's not.
I mean, it's nowhere near where it was when I came to the city 40 years ago, but there's still some left over. There's still little things that occur.
But even just the last name, I don't know if Weinstein is, you know, is that German or...
If it's Weinstein, it's German. If it's Weinstein, it's...
See what I mean? But then to generate dialogue between, you know, between people. It starts a conversation.
Right here.
My last name is Rubenstein, and we're not from German background.
I'm sorry for that.
I want to piggyback on the culture aspect, because what I was saying before, a lot of times from our cultural institutions, you don't see color. And I wanted to pull on your experiences. What are some good models that have been able to link the two communities, the African American and the Jewish communities, together through a cultural vein, such as theater, music, art? I'll just give two examples. Maryland State Arts Council, which I am part of, their artists and educators, does a lot of work to try to bridge communities together and to advocate and promote the distinctiveness of our Maryland communities. And they do a very good job on that. In Howard County, a congregation I work with, Beth Shalom, a conservative congregation, has linked itself up very nicely with two black churches that have very long historical roots in Howard County. And Howard County's issues, in some ways, are the same as Baltimore when you think in terms of history. I'm just curious, what are some good models out there? I find that when I see these programs done that I've seen, whether it's a program that was at Center Stage, that was, I can't remember the name of that great theater piece about you going to a museum and you see a different aspect of African American history, or going into Walter's Art Gallery when they open it up to the black community, or the Baltimore Art Museum. It's opened up like during Martin Luther King Jr. weekend. But they're just one-time things and then they don't carry on. What are some good models that we might look to that could carry on that dialogue?
I thought you named some of them. Yeah. Well, no, I mean, the boards of all the cultural organizations are now integrating in a way that they hadn't in the past. But I just think that, again, you're talking a small group of, a relatively small group of people. It's almost the elites talking to the elites. Once again, there's just, because of the housing segregation and school resegregation, there is very little opportunity for community-to-community contact on an ongoing basis.
Is there a possibility, I mean, one of the things I think that I'm hearing here from all of you and from people in the audience who came here this evening, people who came to this conversation, and I think when you look at the overarching issues, the problems of education in Baltimore City, and the issues of poverty, especially the African American community in this city, I mean, how do you change the face of those and the face of the dialogue that's fighting to change that? In other words, one of the things we're talking about here is this intractable issue that's in front of these communities, and of this group of blacks and Jews in this town that do talk to one another and are attempting some kind of conversation and dialogue. But beyond the dialogue, and I must say, frankly, sometimes I get bored with dialogue because it becomes just that.
There was one article that that's in there, the Julius Lester piece, I think is really important. He talked about the fact that in the class that he teaches at, I think it's UMass, he teaches a course on Black-Jewish relations.
Right.
And he says that 70% of the class is usually Jewish students, and or maybe 70 people, I guess he said, and only 10 were African American. I'm not sure, at least the generation that George was talking about, are young people now in high school and below, that there is even, an interest in this dialogue. They, kind of peripheral maybe, if you have a teacher, a progressive teacher who's going to do something, but left to their own devices, I don't know that the young people would want to or care about engaging in this dialogue, because again, on the street, day in and day out, they don't see any.
There's no reason to see this.
Let's take a picture of what's going on in the community. We've got two institutions, the police department and the education department, that has collapsed. In the black community, they're trapped with the perpetrators and also with lawless law enforcement. So there's no way to turn. And this is only going to get worse. And I was city solicitor when the riots occurred. We had a garbage strike, and then we had the riots. That was a terrible time. And the hatred that evolved out of that is still going on. And
on both sides.
On all sides. And so we are really two separate and distinct communities in two separate and distinct worlds. I mean, Kurt and I, as someone mentioned, I don't know whether you realize, but the talented 10th. But we're a very small percentage of the community, and the masses are worried about poverty. They're not worried about race relations.
Yeah, here. Let me go right here first, and then go to you.
I'm 28 years old. I wasn't born during the riots, and
So, you know, I was born in '77, so I came after the fact. But it played a role because, you know, I grew up, I'm a native of Baltimore. And I went to Mervo, and, you know, I had some white students and I had some, I don't know if they were any Jewish students, but I didn't get to know them, not that I didn't want to, but it was my surroundings. So, and I'm growing up now, and I'm still here in Baltimore, and I can tell you that when I look at the news and I see what's going on with the school system, my children, when I have children, I don't want to send them there. So it's like where, but I want them to have or be around their culture, but I want them to experience other cultures. So it's very difficult at this point, you know, in my life. And so I'm like, okay, what do I do? You know, I want to have them exposed to everything. But then there's other people in my circle that feel the same way. So if we're going to start somewhere, I mean, you guys have experienced that point of your life with the riots and Dr. King. But now it's out, you know, we're here. And what do we do? I mean, tell me what I need to do, you know, to get the dialogue. I'm a member of BLEWS, so yeah, I can start with that. But to get other people involved, other people in my age bracket, to start having a dialogue, to even think about it, because I can tell you, I told some of my friends, well, I'm going to BLEWS Leadership Conference. What's BLEWS? I don't know what that is. And that's something that I face, or that at least for my age. And I can tell you that a lot of people think the way.
Then they ask you why you do it.
Well, I mean, I'll tell them.
Oh, no, I mean, that's in their mind.
Oh, yeah. So, but it's just, where do we go from here? I mean, I'm here.
You know, it's interesting. My first year in office, elected state secretary. So it was in 1988. One of the first initiatives that we did was to hold a summit on race relations. Now, Gil was one of the organizers. Was that 88, 89?
1990.
It was 90? Okay, first term then in office. And we had about 3,000 people down at the convention center to talk about not Black-Jewish relations, but race generally in Baltimore. We asked people to leave there and have these kinds of discussions in their homes, churches, synagogues, mosques, whatever. And I think what we ended up doing was having a nice day. We did a report, and then that was it. And so it was hard to keep that momentum going, because in our daily lives we went back to, you know, survival for the day and dealing with those immediate things. And as Matt mentioned, nobody wants to talk about it.
Well, we have separated ourselves from society because everything that we do is black, black, black. And it's very difficult when people only identify with their race and not interested in integrating into the system. And it's a big challenge.
Let me just say real quick on the schools. I'm going to be real fast. The biggest problem, I spent 12 years of my life trying to make improvements there. The system is divided. If you look at the pie shape on the budget, the finances of the city schools, it's a third local resources, a third state, and it's a third federal. And all three of them have regulations, and laws, and you push on one, and the other one pulls. One of the greatest principles, in my view, that we had was at Mervo, and got driven out because of federal their view of non-compliance with federal laws. And she's producing kids that are going on to college and doing all kinds of wonderful things, but because of dealing with the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, boom, she comes in. And so what, you know, the local people are trying to move forward, and yet you can't because of this. And so what you now have is this pie shaped, divided three ways, plus a federal court order, plus the legislature looking at you, and now no child left behind. And so you try to, and you try to solve that. And that's what, yeah. But anyway, I just wanted to show you the challenge of trying to, and even with 12 years in it, trying to get it done, it was just a battle that I think the best thing to do is after the elections, you get the governor, the mayor, the school superintendent in a room together, no food, and keep them in there until they agree on a 10-year plan for the system.
I like that idea a great deal. Look here.
Penny would have everything.
Yeah, but that perfect.
I presume you're a minister or reverend?
Yes.
Reverend
Hathaway.
Hello.
Union Baptist Church.
You mentioned anger when you were talking, and one of the things that the panelists haven't spoken about schools, economics is huge, of course, but the families. Mr. Russell, lack of religion is another thing that was spoken about, or lack of values that you see. I think a lot of people, maybe it's that is a class, very much a class. I mean, the people who, you don't see that in the culture or on TV, the representations of the African American community, usually it's pretty bad. I mean, I don't know what you think. You don't see the people living in Prince George's County and the largest growing black middle class or whatever that we have. But I don't know how much there is as Jewish people, that we can really do other than to have a dialogue and to share information. But within the black community, what I wonder about is what happened. I mean, maybe I have some sort of stereotypical view of remembering when I was younger, but remembering, so many just families, even if they were poor families, families. And now I see in my work where I do pro bono work, and I deal with people who are children in need of assistance, and I see these young mothers in Baltimore City, and you wonder, and what I often think about is, the Jewish community is a huge social network where people fall through the cracks, but where there's a huge amount of money raised, and there's a huge effort to take care of your own. And I'm sure that goes in and goes on in the black community, and it seems like there's just such a huge job for you guys. I mean, the elites you are, the elites of the community. And I wonder how people feel about that. I mean, to me, I feel like Jack Abramoff, for example. Okay, to me, it's hugely embarrassing. And to the, as a Jewish person, it's like terrible.
It's collective guilt.
That's true, right? But I mean, and like this, I'm just making a point. Like my child goes to a Jewish day school. And I'm happy with that, and I will teach him to respect other people, and hopefully he'll do programs like this. It's not the same as being in a school that's just diverse. But I wouldn't mind if, there's a new Catholic school that's forming in Baltimore City. I think that's great. I think you do a good job of educating children. But the point is, 2 points. One, as Jews, there isn't so much I think that we can do. I mean, we can help push for the right economic programs and policies to help politically, to help the African American community. But what do you all, feel? I know you're working hard to improve things, but what sort of do you think happened? I mean, that is a huge question. But when you go out, Mr. Russell, I mean, and Mr. Schmoke, I mean, I don't think it was a situation that we have today, and it's so sad.
You can't count us. I mean, my grandfather was born in Baltimore, and I had a mother and father, and I was brought up in the Catholic Church, and these values were instilled in us. Even with my own son, he went to Friends, but he went to Morehouse College in Atlanta, because I wanted him to understand who he was and to relate to his own ethnic group. And to me, that was a wise decision, because he made permanent friends, and of course Morehouse is one of the outstanding schools in the nation. But you can't compare, you used the word that Steve got. You said you people. And it's not right to put the burden on me and Schmoke.
Let me, after start with Matt's time period after 1968. If you look at the mix in the economy of Baltimore up until that time, you could have the same kind of school system and you could have the same dropout rate. But a dropout of Baltimore schools in 1965 could go to Bethlehem Steel and live a middle-class life. By the time that I worked at Bethlehem Steel, so the summer of 1969, they were starting to reduce the plant dramatically. And when I became mayor, what used to be a 30,000-person plant was 9,000 people. When I came, and by the time I left, it was down to about 7,500. The economics of this community changed dramatically in a way that what was open to a lot of families all of a sudden was shut. And then late in the 70s, crack happened.
Yeah, I think that's a...
Crack came straight down the East Coast, and it just devastated poor communities. So what you add in Baltimore, I understand now, half of the state's welfare recipients live in this jurisdiction. They're not scattered around, but right here in Baltimore. 50% of welfare recipients live right here in Baltimore. That's an incredible concentration of poverty, not seen in many cities around the country.
It's 60% of the people below the poverty line. But I think just to underline one thing Mayor Schmoke said, is when those good blue-collar jobs that you could get, even if you were a high school graduate, when they disappeared, the other thing that disappeared was marriageable black men. And that's when you got this huge increase in female-headed households. But I feel compelled to say something cheerful. Not being black or Jewish. It's easy for me, of course. But the percentage of black children born out of wedlock in Baltimore City is declining. The percentage of teenage mothers is declining. For what it's worth, it's probably not worth a lot. Test scores in the school system have actually been going up. Although the mayor exaggerates it, it's probably true that violent crime has been going down, but not nearly as much as he says it is. I think the main optimistic, well, it's not that optimistic, but the main point to emphasize is that we're all saying how only a small group of people were active in the civil rights movement, a small group of Jews, a small group of blacks. Look what that small group of people did.
Right.
It's possible in this society, in this city, because we are all from the same city, we live in the same place. It's possible, and I've seen it happen, for a relatively small group of people who are determined to get a great deal done.
Matt, let me just throw a question out to all of you. We'll go back to all of you as well, because everything's just been said here. And I mean, to look at, I think it's probably a mistake, at least from my perspective, to look at the poverty of the inner city and the issues in Baltimore as a black problem. It's an American problem. And I think that the same way I have my issues sometimes in black history, is not black history, it's part of American history. It needs to be American history. So when you look at a group like this, and the issues that were raised here tonight by many people here and by many people on this panel, all four of you, about the issues of poverty and education in the city, and what you just said, Matt, it seems to me, if you went beyond just a dialogue between blacks and Jews, that what would happen, and how do you make it happen, for a leadership of a group like this to be a public face, to fight poverty, and a public face to fight for an education system for all the students, and make that the public face of the black Jewish world, and not this dialogue between people who like each other anyway, in this room.
I was going to, a couple of things. I think one of the things that we focus on Baltimore City, Matt, this is for you. I don't live in the city. I've never lived in the city. I'm committed to the city. I'm dedicated to the city. If the city fails, the region fails. We are all in this together. And unfortunately, because of politics, I don't know on which side, it's not important. We too many times fail to think of this as the Baltimore region. If you think the city schools are bad, the county schools are not far behind. The other thing, though, I think is, as I looked at the program that you're doing, I had the privilege a lot of years ago of participating in the leadership program, the Baltimore, Greater Baltimore Committee Leadership Program, and it seems that some of this is patterned after. One of the things that we had to do, this is a suggestion, you guys run the program, we had projects. We couldn't just go and learn about what was happening in the city. We had teams, and each team had to pick a project, and we had to follow through with that project. One of the projects I was involved in was really frustrating and really difficult, was getting some schools in Park Heights to be open in the summer, so kids didn't have a drop-off in what they learned over the summer. We had to fight tooth and nail, and one of the people on my team was an administrator in the public schools. She was an assistant principal. It was really hard, but maybe, I don't know if there's a project at the end of this or not, but you want to do more than talk, you got to have a plan to do something.
Let's hear what folks think about this idea. Exist here and then there, okay?
One of the things Judge Russell and Kurt brought up was there's so many people who are not from Baltimore, and one thing you have to understand, blacks follow Jews into their community. When I was growing up, there was always a Jewish store, now they're Korean stores. And you talk about the economic imperative. Everybody worked at Sparrows Point for the federal government. When Sparrows Point went on strike, the Jewish stores supported the black community. Everybody had an account, and you went over there, and you could tell who was doing bad. And Seymour used to tell, well, you know, the so-and-sos aren't doing good. And he would tell you, you know, Mrs. So-and-so and them don't have any food. And the communities were cohesive. And he said they have, you know, I've been feeding them for 2 weeks, you know, something's going on, check them out. It was community, and I think that lack of community and cohesiveness, and that was when the riots came in '68, the Jewish community felt so betrayed, because a lot of those stores in the Jewish communities supported black families when they had hard times. And when those jobs, those good jobs, because there were middle-class people, you did not have to have a college education. I mean, all our parents sent us to school about college education, you know. But that was a history of why this community felt betrayed, the Jewish community, the black community separated, because they had been that cohesiveness.
No, I was just thinking, in my opinion, I think one of the problems is a sense of, and just my personal opinion, with a lot of black people, is a sense of contentment, where I was just thinking back in the past, and I think about black colleges, where we always fought and protest just to get things we got. And I know I look at my family, they're just trying to survive. Even though there's a lot of racism and issues they deal with, but you know what, my bills are paid, my kids are going to school, we're healthy, so you know what, let's not fight about anything else. I'll wait for the next man to do it. So it's really about trying to ruffle their feathers and say, hey, you know, don't be content with just surviving. What are we going to do to get you to be active? And I look at black colleges, because I know I went to Morgan, and I was one of the organizers for the protests for the library. And now I look at the people that are still at Morgan, there's so many issues that they're dealing with politically and just trying to get funding, and they won't do anything about it. And I'm just saying, like, what's wrong with y'all? Do something. Please do something. Don't sit there and allow them to run your school. This is your school, but they're just content with getting an education, partying, doing whatever they do, that they don't want to fight for anything. So it's really getting people to feel encouraged that it's okay to fight, and I think that may be reflected in the Jewish community too. You're living your lives, so let's not ruffle feathers. Let's just keep on doing what we do and not even worry about anything else.
I wanted to start by I was a little disappointed actually with the response that Mayor Schmoke gave to you about your question about what am I going to do with when I have children in schools, because what I wanted to say was, yeah, the school system is a wreck, but there are people working hard, and there are individual pockets where you can make it, and I think it's worth the struggle as an individual to try. For example, there's Roland Park Elementary, there's Roland Park Middle, there are the magnet schools, and it's hard for one person to say to another person, well, you should be involved in that fight, but you wouldn't be alone if you were, and it seems to me that on one level, individuals have no choice but to commit themselves to living their values, and if they believe in these things, to doing them personally. I wanted to segue from that to say, I hope at some point we touch on the provincial quality of the Jewish community of Baltimore. For those of you in the room who are not Jewish, you may be making some assumptions about the community that, maybe I wouldn't share. I do not come from Baltimore, so I am not a Baltimore Jewish person. I find the style of the Baltimore Jewish community very shocking to me. Jews in Baltimore tend to live in certain neighborhoods. They are so tight. I mean, there are many children who go to synagogue with my children who are seventh generation members of the same synagogue. And these people don't necessarily want to mix with people who are non-Jewish. I mean, we're not talking about blacks here. We're just talking about white folks who are not Jewish. I mean, it's a very, very tight community. They marry within the community. Their whole ambition for themselves is wrapped up in the community. So when you're talking about engaging that community, that raises issues. I don't think you can ignore it. See, well, I guess the reason I say that is, to me, the only answer is pluralism. The only answer, ultimately, is living next door to people of different backgrounds. Because unless we really learn about other people, there can't be any solution on a political level, on a macro level, unless we actually live together. The Jewish community of this town tends to not want to live together. They don't even want to even live with people who are not Jewish in a lot of cases. They just want to live with other Jewish folks.
That's changing somewhat. You're right about the Jewish community. When a Jewish person asks another Jewish person in Baltimore, where did you go to school? They don't mean City College. They mean what public school, elementary school did you go to? That's how far back their relationships go. But it is changing. Jews are moving into Roland Park, where they weren't allowed. Well, they
snuck it.
Yeah, well, and I'm not sure that the covenants really existed in some of the more recent research. They're moving into Roland Park, they're moving into Homeland. The Jewish community is spreading out, but by and large, you're right. The Jewish community lives, as Kurt said, this is the most segregated community, ethnically segregated. Look at Little Italy. This is the most ethnically segregated community probably in the United States.
It's still the tipping point. Still applies to real estate, and all the realtors will tell you that. You get to a certain level, boom, that community's gone. I mean, Edmondson Village turned over, what, 5 years, less than 5 years, from 90% white to 90% African American.
Rebecca.
Being from a latter generation and having everybody's input about civil rights movement and galvanizing people. I guess my question and comment is, where does the interplay of the faith-based community play into it? I know I'm a Baptist, I'm a Southern Baptist, and I go to a Baptist church. And oftentimes I hear preachers talking about why aren't the congregation mobilized to do things in the community. And so my question would be, in Baltimore, where is the interdenominational or interfaith commitment? And what is that one issue that they're committed to changing? Because it's so many things. In part of my work, I work with 45 Baltimore City schools. And before I started working with them intimately, I watched the news like everybody else and was pretty much saddened by the school system. But the day-to-day reality of what the kids deal with, quite frankly, depresses me. And so what is that one thing that the interfaith community is committed to or will be committed to making happen?
I think that's another sad story that's unique to Baltimore. People have said that the most segregated time of the week is Sunday morning, and I imagine that's still the case. This is the only community I've lived in. I've lived as a rabbi in Houston and Davenport, Iowa, in the suburb of Chicago, and for 25 years, almost 25 years here, I'm getting close to becoming accepted as a Baltimorean. This is the only community I've ever lived in where there is no interdenominational ministerial association. There is an organization called the Interdenominational Ministerial Alliance. It's 99.9 African American. I tried to become a member of it. I went to a couple of meetings. They never said
with federal law. Just got to sit still for 15 years. We didn't go anywhere in integration until the early 1970s, by the time it was too late. I went in 1954 from a legally segregated elementary school to a legally integrated junior high school, called, ironically, Robert E. Lee School. And it was a very enlightening experience for me. It was the first time I'd gone to a racially integrated public school. Nobody no teacher, no principal, no vice principal, no counselor ever said a word to us about what was going on. And I think that's classic Baltimore. You just don't like to talk about it. And I think that's what this group can start to do, is to begin the discussion.
We're going to George McFloyd, and we'll go back to the audience here.
Well, I just had some thoughts. I believe that the attempt to integrate public schools destroyed it. During segregation, many of the teachers could not go to the University of Maryland, and they all received $5,000 to go to any university they wanted because they couldn't go to Maryland. I remember when I finished law school, they wouldn't permit me to take a bar review course. I had to study on my own, along with the other black members, well, the two others. But instead, these teachers, Columbia and New York University, came to Baltimore at Douglas High School and taught the teachers, and they were all getting masters and PhDs. And when integration came, those highly qualified teachers were put in the white schools, and the black schools got the least qualified white teachers. And that, in my judgment, began to decline because the cohesiveness of segregation, as wrong as it was, but everybody knew everyone, I know, and the knowledge of each other in the community enabled the community to set high moral standards, and everyone would look out for each other. When integration came, all of that was gone, and now we don't have that kind of cohesiveness that's required for a community to succeed. But most of all is that there's no standard of moral accountability that's mutually accepted. And once you do not believe in God, what other mutuality is there for you? And I believe that's primarily the primary source of the disintegration in the African American community. And but this organization is vital if we are to have any hope in regards to the intergroup relations. And I applaud you for persevering under these terrible conditions, particularly conditions of poverty that exist. And it's difficult to talk to a person who's poor, has little education, and they don't know where the next meal is coming from, and that's pervasive. I look at East Baltimore with Johns Hopkins expanding. That's fine for Johns Hopkins. Where do those people go? Where do they go? When they close the block, where do those people go? And so what it is, it's the neighborhoods becoming deteriorated, and it's a real problem. And as I said, this is just reflective of what Katrina demonstrated. Now, I keep emphasizing Katrina because we saw the literature from the economists in London, from Italy, all of the European countries, all over the world, at once found out our dirty little secret here in America. And the economists, this is Pete Angelos brought this back, they had a lady in the water. And it had New Orleans, and at the top is the shame of America. And so we have a great deal to overcome, but we have to start within our own community and attempt to teach the history. You can't go forward if you don't know your history. And these kids out here have no concept of slavery, and indeed, in some states, American history is taught from Reconstruction forward. Nothing about slavery is taught. And one of the things in the course that was introduced, we had in Baltimore County, at Lock Raven School, was 85% white. And those kids were discussing slavery, why the slaves ran, why they escaped. They had a big quotation from Reverend Harold Carter there. And once I saw these white kids interacting about slavery, they were excited. And, but yet we can't get it in Baltimore City, where it's needed. This is what these kids need to understand, their own history and their own legacy.
I'm surprised to hear you say that, talk about the lack of faith. The black community is supposed to be the largest church-going community in the country. I don't know if that's changed. And I think that one of the things that probably ought to be discussed at some point is the relationship between black churches and synagogues, which has a kind of a checkered relationship in many ways. There have been great programs. Steve Forstenser mentioned a program that we had at Har Sinai and Brown's Memorial when Doug Miles was the pastor there. Doug left, everything changed. It became a different congregation. The people became different. They weren't interested in continuing that kind of dialogue. I think as far as the schools are concerned, my impression of what's happened in Baltimore City, not having grown up there, is that the overwhelmingly vast private school system here, which I have never experienced anywhere else that I've ever lived in my life, has been perhaps, I will put it, it's a two-edged sword. It may be one of the greatest benefits of living in this city because they produce brilliant kids. I think it has been unbelievably detrimental to the city schools. You don't have people like these three people. Yeah, you do. I mean, City College is still a great school, but is it the same caliber as...
All due respect to your high school.
Well, those three. Poly wasn't in City or great. But I mean, I don't know the answer. Are the caliber of kids there the same as Mark and Kirk?
But the problem is that from back in the middle 1960s, we had 4 or 5 very strong high schools, and today we've got 4 or 5 very strong high schools, and then the rest of the high school system is weak, and that's probably, and the private schools have probably become more integrated than the public schools.
Yeah, I think they are.
Sure. Folks, I'm going to let you, the first hand up was way back there.
Thank you very much, Mark. I'm going to ask a very difficult question, and so Professor Crenson, I'll need your kind of moral support here. You know, it's an interesting concept. I mean, if the Jews had not gotten involved with the civil rights movement to the level that they did, and I'm kind of dovetailing on your question, Mark, we probably wouldn't be sitting here today. And I was just curious, if something similar to the Holocaust were to take place here and now, you know, where would African Americans stand?
The Holocaust for whom?
For Jews. If Jews were being removed from this area slowly but surely, or something like that, or not even Jews, but any, you know, would African Americans stand up for Jews in the same way that Jews had stood up for African Americans? It's just throwing that out there.
You're also talking about visible Jews, but not that many. Read Taylor's books. Yes, there were very important people. The NAACP would not have gotten started had it not been for, well, no, the Sears, the guy that owned Sears, who put up a lot of the money, and a guy named Kimmy Kaplan in Boston, who put up a lot of the money for that. But they were, it wasn't, I must be honest with you, it wasn't a mass movement of Jews. We know the names, you know, Goodman and Schwarter, we know the names, we know Heschel. But there were a lot of Jews who either sat on the sidelines and sat on their hands or said, this is going to change my world.
The vast majority of whites in the civil rights movement.
There were a larger percentage of Jews in the civil rights movement than the part of the general population.
But Taylor points out that the blacks, too, weren't that many.
That's correct, yeah.
But I think that the question he asked, I mean, if you twist it around, I got emails today that I was going to bring with me, but actually rushed out and forgot them. But I got a number of emails about this. When you talk about the issue where it is today, maybe people can honestly talk about this for a minute. I mean, if you go outside this room, and people, similar to people in this room, the email had to do with the rumor about the uproar that never happened, but became a rumor, a living rumor, an urban legend, recently at Mount Washington Elementary School, where certain Jews in the school, parents were alleged to use the N-word. And that actually came out of another meeting with an elementary school in that area, where an older Jewish man was very upset because he was attacked by some young black kids, and said it was like the Holocaust, they're attacking us again. And so, but what that did was, and I'm on a couple of these email list conversations, and one of them has to be mostly African American, where every time it comes up, there's this anti-Semitism that flies out from this email group. And I'm always flying back to it, trying to counter it with some notions, but it's very real. And I think the same takes place in the Jewish world. I mean, I think that one of the things that we don't talk about a lot, is that beneath the surface of the great dialogue and cooperation that's happened in the liberal establishment, in the progressive establishment, in the black and Jewish leadership of this community, there's something else going on that we often don't want to talk about. Sure.
There are a couple of things. Steve Forcenter. First, in response to what you said, and what Floyd said, the mayor, there's not a lot of people. Du Bois said the talented 10th. And he's not talking just about blacks. And if we're lucky, across the board, there are 10% of people who really give a damn about almost anything. Some of us in the union movement, some of us in the religious movement, but when you go and begin to talk to people, you know, I've got a couple of kids who are active in crazy things, and people say to me, why are they active in it? Why are they doing this? And they have friends who ask them the same questions I got asked in the 60s. Why are you involved in that? You're not really, you know, part of that. And that's a problem that we have to begin to talk about, and it's coming out here, but it brings both groups at loggerheads. And I think it was fascinating when the professor said that there were so many groups in both groups that it mitigated against any unity. Whether it's 50 synagogues or 50 churches. If you've got small power structures, people, especially if we perceive ourselves as outsiders, build our little walls around our own organization so we have some power somewhere. But to come back to the education thing, which is my question. Since integration, and more in this city than I've seen in any other place, why was it that the religious organizations were the ones that established segregated private schools? Why do we end up with Christian academies and some Jewish schools that were clearly set up so that we don't go with those folks anymore? It's a series, you know, where was religion in all of this?
It's a southern city. You think it's bad here. It is a southern city. It's definitely a southern city. When I came here from Chicago, I called my wife, and I grew up in the South. I said, Barbara, I feel like I'm home. People here don't sound like they do in Chicago. Go to Boston.
No, it is a southern city.
You know, I thought having this meeting here today, I mean, it was right on point because of what had happened last Thursday with the lieutenant governors. And I thought it was, I was like, all right, I know we're going to talk about this.
Yeah, I can get that too.
So I'm surprised, I mean, it hasn't come up yet. And I was listening
Which
to
part?
that.
You mean his stem cell?
Right, his statement about stem cell research. So I mean, I read the comment and I listened to a Stephen dialogue and pontificated about on WBAL. And my reading of it was not the same as how it was interpreted by the media, but with that said, I also understand that the Jewish community, or many in the Jewish community, I'm not going to say all, but many in the Jewish community, they were offended about the comment, and I was hoping that we would at least talk about it so that I could understand that what bothered people about it, and because I know many times when the view of things are that things are real tough, people will tend to compare it to the history of slavery, and it's that comparison that Holocaust, which is, I mean, that's how it was viewed by some blacks, that was our Holocaust. that comparison doesn't bother me. What I take from it is that person who is using that analogy is saying, look, this situation is so bad and hurting the community so much